All right, awesome. Welcome everybody. It is Thursday, March 5th, 2026. I'm here for season 3, episode 3 of Stride Live. I am joined with fractional CFO Matt Kerrigan, and we are talking about budgeting beyond the spreadsheet, how spreadsheets are lying, and we're going to talk all around how budgeting can be much more proactive for you. Matt, how are you doing today?
Great. How are you, Casey?
Good. I am good. It has been a busy day. This is a great topic because this is a conversation I have had dozens of times at the beginning of this year, as I'm sure you have. I know we've talked with many clients about budgeting, how important it is, how it's never too late, and why everybody needs one. But today I want to take it, and this topic is really more than just the basics of why you need a budget and really how to take that budget from being something that you build and don't really follow and making it a more proactive tool, an active, living, breathing resource of your business. And we're going to focus on how it impacts MSPs, just digital agencies, and really professional businesses today. So, Matt, thank you for joining. What is the first thing? Let's talk about it. In your eyes, what is kind of that where people are missing most often with their budgeting process?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I see this all the time, Casey, where I'll start working with new clients and I look at kind of how they've dealt with budgeting in the past. And they really use that whack-a-mole approach where the sales will be down for 1 month, 1 quarter, and all of a sudden they're cutting expenses, margins are down. Hey, let's raise prices, or cash flow is lower in a particular period. And all of a sudden they're like, okay, we need a higher freeze hiring. And the issue with that is it's not that long-term approach. It's more reactive where if you want budgeting to be proactive, you really need that long-term plan. So I sit down with clients and what I really want to get them to start doing is thinking about that 3-year time horizon. You start looking out further than 3 years, there's a lot that could go on that's really difficult to predict. But in 3 years, it's really asking yourself, like, what do you want for the company financially? Do you want to focus on sales growth? Do you want to focus on expanding margins? Are you going to prepare for an exit? Do you need to prep the business because you want to move on and do something else? So really, when you start with that 3-year approach, now all of a sudden your budgeting is no longer reactive because it's a plan. And then when you focus on what do I need to do in the next 12 months in order to really gear the company towards that direction in that 3-year time period, is really effective. And what I mean by that is not just simply, hey, I want my sales to be this plus 10% this year. That's not a real plan. There's not a lot of meat to it, but instead focus on those activities that are needed to achieve the growth you're looking for. So if we focus just simply on sales, what's that new logo growth that is required to hit that goal? And saying that new logo growth, is it that top of funnel that really we need to expand those opportunities? Or is it a matter of we need the sales team to focus on improving close rates? And once you do that, once you figure out those sales objectives, then that really, then you focus on what level of investment that I need in the business in order to achieve those goals. Can I get those from the current cash reserves that I have? Can I do that from cash flow from operations? Or do I need to fund that growth through external means? And all this is that proactive approach that provides clarity, and then it really helps avoid making those hasty decisions by just doing reactive approaches to forecasting.
Yeah, I think often we talk about that difference between proactive, reactive, and you mentioned it's how do you build truth to the reality of your finances and those predictions. It shouldn't just be like you mentioned that blanket, oh, increase by 10%. No, it's taking the time and looking and digging into what is reasonable sales growth. And usually, I mean, I'm sure you would agree, it's sometimes you have to look backwards to get an idea of where you need to look moving forwards. And can you kind of talk about that? Like, what should a business owner, especially an MSP, how far back to their financials should they be looking? How do they start that process of building a more proactive budget? Where do they start that process?
Yeah, the first approach is really looking at your reoccurring sales. Like that's going to be the foundation of your forecast. If you're building a business that's really really tied to project work or particular, like let's say hardware sales, as an MSP, where it can be very volatile and very difficult to predict. That reoccurring business, that business that you're currently having, and combining that with what's that historical churn rate. The one thing that I often see with clients is they like to think that they keep all their clients, and then you do that review and it turns out you have a churn rate of 1.5% every month on average. And they might be startled by that, but factoring that into that forecast, that hey, this is something that will happen. So if I want to grow 10% every year, I have to know I'm going to lose a certain percentage, and you can do activities to prevent that. But looking back over time, that tends to be, say, 2 to 3 years is typical. And then figuring out, hey, is there any cyclicality to my business that I need to project as well? I have some cases when I'm working with MSPs where their project work is very very cyclical, because people might go on vacations during the summer, and so that time period is really slow for that project work. And then I have other clients where there's really no cyclicality at all, in terms of it's one year to the next, it can be very different. So looking that back 2 or 3 years to help guide you, to make sure you're not making projections that just aren't based on reality. Because the second that you create a plan that isn't based in reason and fact, your team is not going to buy into it. And that's the number one thing. So when we have a sales goal, if the number one thing, if people see it within your organization and they're like, we can't do that, you've lost them from the start. You need to make sure they have buy-in. And that's where it really comes to involving your team in that process. It cannot be simply the owner and maybe their finance leader doing this exercise. We call that like a spreadsheet exercise, where you do it and then you kind of put it away. It's not there. This, instead, you want involve as many team members as it makes sense. And then you want to also factor in their goals and any incentive comp. You want to tie it to that plan as well, so everyone is marching in the same direction to achieve that plan.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned, interestingly enough, and I think this is a common misconception, where do you start? Well, you start with the recurring sales. And I think when so many business owners think budget, they automatically go exactly to spending. Like, oh, it's spending. It's what can I spend each year? And it's like, well, no, when you think of a budget, think of that as what is the reasonable expense, revenue, level of financial performance that I'm going to have in a year. And I think, Matt, what would you say, like, for those MSPs or business owners that think of a budget as such an expense tool? How do you change that perception to say, no, this is something that you use to gauge the performance of your business, not just how much you're spending in your business?
Well, the number one thing is, when I'm starting working with a new client, if they use the word expenses, costs, stuff like that, I will help them change their mind and view them. They are investments. You choose to make an investment. So you invest in people, you invest in the tools that support generating your revenue. So when you flip that mindset of it's not an expense, it's an investment that I choose to make, then you kind of change your mindset. So whenever I go into a budgeting exercise with a client, the number one thing that I do is what I call a target margin setting process. And with that, then the first thing is, what's that sales goal that you have for the time horizon we're looking at? Next 3 years, next year, whatever the case might be. And once we come up with what's that sales goal, now we look at what's the level of investment needed to support that goal. Because if you say I'm going to grow sales 10%, but I want to cut expenses 10%, right there, that's a red flag, and saying, okay, those two probably don't align with each other, and therefore when you have that misalignment, you're probably going to create a plan that's not going to be effective. So it's that mind shift, especially on, again, investments, that you really have to work with people on these budgets to understand, to really appreciate.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that shift in the mindset is huge. And then understanding what investment looks like. And investment, I mean, you mentioned, oh, I want an increase of sales, but a decrease in cost. It's not to say that it's not possible. It means that, well, you can't always just say those things are going to be mutually true or exclusive because, there's a realistic situation. You could increase your sales. Let's say you have strong inbound sales growth, but you're overspending in other areas. Maybe your costs aren't optimized on your subscriptions. One of the areas we see are credit card fees, subscriptions that you're not using, tools that you're using and you use for client services, especially in the MSPs. You don't have anybody paying for those licenses, or you're not doing your variance agreement maintenance and additions and maintenance on your PSA side. So I think when you look at it, it's using that factuality. And I think that really goes into it. Kind of my next question: how does an MSP or how does a professional service business say, hey, do I have a clear path ahead for sustainable growth? And what can I do from a perspective, like you mentioned, where should they be focusing to say, hey, I'm going to set myself up for sustainable growth? You can't increase sales by 20% and then have, a 50% reduction in marketing costs. But where is that realistic picture that you see and saying, hey, if you're looking to grow, you can reasonably expect this type of sustainable growth moving forward?
Great question. Yes, sustainable growth, that always comes back to that reoccurring revenue, especially for MSPs, because that's going to be the foundation that growth is based off of. So if I'm working with a new client and I look back the past 12 months and I see this really big hardware order, let's say 500,000, pretty large, and then I talk to them about it. It's likely a one-off. They got a new client, needed a total overhaul, and that was one moment in time purchase that's not expected to repeat. So this is where you look at that reoccurring revenue, that you have that process in terms of those top of funnel sales opportunities, how you get them through, work them through the funnel, get them to close, how many new clients can you onboard on a weekly, monthly, quarterly basis, what's your churn level. So those things together in terms of what's sustainable is, I'm bringing on new logos at a pretty consistent rate. Maintaining my current customer base, so churn is low, and that way it can be predictable in terms of we know how many people we can onboard, we know roughly what's that new client size that we tend to target, and with that, it's easier from a forecasting standpoint to be able to say, hey, we put in those variables, we're going to add 1 to 2 clients consistently every month, we're going to keep churn down, and that way you have that steady upward growth, and you don't have these big fluctuations because we had a lot of big projects with this one client, we had a lot of hardware sales, again, very volatile. And if you can think about from an owner standpoint, if you're looking at an exit, that reoccurring revenue is going to be viewed so much more valuable to a potential buyer than that spiky project slash hardware sales where it's really unpredictable. You can't count on it from one period to the next, where that reoccurring revenue is like your Netflix subscription. You sign on, you kind of forget about it. So very similar when it comes time to forecasting.
Yeah, I think obviously that predictability in your sales and revenue is where it all starts. So you have some sort of grounding of confidence. I know you've mentioned before on other episodes that it's, that budget should be that 99, 98% confident that you can achieve that target if nothing else changes and you hit these reasonable expectations. Now, in terms of the
Well,
spreadsheet,
I'm gonna correct you one
okay.
place there. So a budget, and this was CEO from earlier in my career said you should be able to hit it 2/3 of the time because you still want to be able to stretch your company to, we need to do actions, we need to work in order to make this happen. And so if you make it too easy, then you're not getting the most out of your company and your abilities, where a forecast, that's different. A forecast is, I need to make sure that that's rock solid because I'm making really decisions on the people I employ, the vendors that I work with, to make those decisions on, hey, how much cash will there be at any given period? So that forecast, you should always be forecasting. That needs to be rock solid at 99%, where a budget is more, it's aspirational, but it shouldn't be so out of line of sight where your staff, your leadership sees it, and it's just like there's no way we'll ever achieve this. So think about if you're a golfer, what's that putt where you don't make it every single time, but you know you can make it, but you really have to bear down. You really have to make sure you understand how the green's going to break to bury the putt, or in this case, make the budget.
Yeah, got it. Now, part of it is talking about how you build beyond the spreadsheet. And obviously, you're going to use spreadsheets, you're going to use tools to track these budgets. But how do you build that buy-in? How do you continue to use this and make this a living, breathing? Like, how often are we updating? How often are we reviewing? Kind of how should you be, or how should these business owners be using that budget on a daily, monthly, weekly basis in their business to make it really an impactful tool for their business?
Yeah, great question. So ideally, that budget is the start of the year target that the whole company is working towards. So in terms of that budgeting process, and it's never too late to start. So if you're an owner right now and you're like, oh, it's March, I don't have a budget. We'll do this next year. No, you can always do one. And ideally, you have your leadership team be a part of the process. Again, you don't want it to be simply just the owner and a finance person just locked in a room figuring it out, because if that's the case, you're not going to necessarily have buy-in. So you think of it as it's sort of like a negotiation where you're telling each of your key business leaders of the organization to what do you need to support the end goal. And the end goal tends to be sales related. So what does everyone need? If you're in terms of you support current clients, what do you need to keep churn low? If you're in sales, what do you need to generate the opportunities that we need to support that sales goal? So all the leaders give all their ask, and then it's up to the owner, the finance person to really make those decisions from an investment standpoint. What areas do we want to invest in? What areas do we not want to? But because your leadership team played a role in that, you're more likely to get that buy-in. So that budgeting process, that tends to be once a year, maybe a refresh at the midway point. And then forecasting is something that just always happens. So as you get new information, then you update the forecast. It should be the best estimate at this time. And then we always judge the forecast versus the budget. Are we on track? Are we not? If we're not on track, what are those things we need to do to get back on track? So forecasting, the viewpoint in the organization is that we always forecast, meaning when someone in the leadership team or that has a budget responsibility discovers something new news, that it is notified so the forecast is updated, that they don't hold on to that information. So if they are aware that, hey, we're going to have a significant increase in a vendor spend, that information is given as quickly as possible, because maybe you want to change vendors, maybe you want to look at different options. But if they don't give that information, if they think I just give this at budget time, then it might be too late to act.
Yeah, and I think that's really key, and I think you made it clear. And we are going to have another topic either later this month or early April, talking about really how to proactively forecast and really forecasting for business owners and what that process looks like. But on the budgeting side, what are some, just on the MSP, what are some key performance indicators, or how often do you see MSPs adding those goals and KPIs directly into that budget so their team sees it? Like, gross margin, EBITDA, or maybe they have a large percentage. Hey, 12% of our revenue comes from one client. How are we shifting revenue away from that? Do you see elements like that, or what are some common situations that you've seen that have been helpful for the MSP owners or professional agencies who haven't built their budget to this point and are still in that process?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of metrics, the number one that comes to my mind is, can your reoccurring revenue fund your entire business? And so what that means is, so you look at everything that you're investing in cost of goods sold as well as expenses, strip out any hardware or software resale cost of goods sold. So those items that you can't necessarily control, like strip that out. But all your other costs, your people costs, your overhead, your rent, utilities, stuff like that, can your reoccurring business fund those operations? And why that's important, because then you're not reliant on profits from hardware sales. You're not reliant on, did we get any new projects this month? At the very least, we'll be able to break even every month based on that reoccurring revenue. And for MSPs that are able to do that, their owners have so much more peace of mind and just focus on the future and not being too reactive, because they know, hey, if it's a bad month in some other areas, I'm okay. I'm going to break even. I'm not going to be cash flow negative. So that would be, in my mind, the number one metric that clients should focus on.
What are some other ones that you see are pretty popular? Let's say on the less on the sales side, what about on the expense or the overhead investment side? What are some performance metrics they should be aware of?
Yeah, a key thing there that many clients don't necessarily do with their bookkeeper is to be able to allocate labor that supports service delivery, allocate that labor to cost of goods sold. And the reason why that's important is, let's say you are a low profitable business, maybe even negative. We need to figure out, is the issue that your service delivery is too expensive, or is the issue is you have too much overhead? And you brought up before about using metrics and using benchmarks. That's where, if you're part of a peer reporting group to understand, okay, for the business that I'm in, what is that standard cost of goods sold, that gross margin that we want to target? What is that expense overhead percentage that is also industry standard? To again answer that question of, hey, my profitability is low right now. Do I have too many people supporting current customers? Or do I have a support staff, administration, sales and marketing that might be bigger than what my business can actually support? So that would be another couple of metrics that we really want to focus on, and being able to make sure we understand where we are according to the industry benchmark.
Yeah, I think that's huge. We see that labor allocation all the time and understanding that what is your utilization rate, but then it also what is that coverage rate? How much would the minimum utilization be for my technician to cover? So how much do they actually have to work on billable hours to cover their own salary and their benefits? And that is such an important component because if your minimum utilization rate on your technician is 80 to 85%, it's going to be a lot harder to consistently keep them at that level as opposed to no, their minimum is they need to be at least 60%. And I know every percentage after that is pretty much generating gross profit as a whole from that labor component. I think another important area is the subscriptions, making sure that you're billing and that pass through, understanding, hey, what are all the licenses? What is every percentage and piece that we resell and how much has it cost? I mean, we see that all the time. I talked to an MSP 2 days ago. They said, last year we probably missed about three to $400,000 of revenue on the subscription billing just because we're not overseeing it, we're not managing it, we haven't predicted it, and it's a big component, even if it is only an 8 or a 10 or a 12% gross margin on that SaaS overheads or that resell. It's still cash flow that comes into your business. And I would say, Matt, this is kind of leads to my next question. What are the cash flow considerations, or how can a business owner say, hey, I want to make a cash flow focused budget where I'm really making sure that what I'm putting down here is going to generate cash flow? How do they really take that step to say, I want to see the impact on my bottom line, but in my checking account, in my personal life on a daily basis? How should they go about planning that into their budget?
Yeah, in terms of cash flow, the one thing that can often be missed when we're thinking about, how are we going to forecast for next year is we forecast in terms of how do we see the financials from the bookkeeper. So if you're a business and you're doing accrual based books, it's not uncommon for those people to forecast based on the accrual method. Now, the issue with that is you're going to have some expenses, you're going to have some customer payments where they're paying over a period of time. They might pay in advance by a quarter or for a whole year. Same on the software subscriptions that you have. You might have periods of time where you need to make big cash outlays that cover the service for the entire year. So you need to factor that in so you're able to see, what is my cash doing throughout the period of time, and is there any period where I need to be concerned that it gets too low? Now, we make a recommendation that you want between 3 to 4 months of operating expenses as cash in the bank at any given time. So when you have that as the benchmark and you're able to look at your forecast, do I ever dip below? And if I do, is there a reason why? And what that does when you think of about setting up a budget, it might tell you about when can you hire certain people. You might say, hey,
Yeah.
we're right now we're lower than that benchmark. We need to be able to stockpile a little bit more cash, get to a level where we can then invest in a person. The biggest example of that is bringing in a new salesperson, because
Yeah.
it's often that new salesperson for the first 1, 2, maybe 3 months, they're not going to be that productive because they are learning the ropes. Maybe they need to understand either the industry or your niche in that industry, and you have to factor in that they're not going to be able to hit the ground running. And if you're able to be able to look at your cash forecast and say, hey, we're able to do this. We're able to bring this person online and not add any undue pressure to them so that they can onboard at a rate that they can handle. That way,
Hmm.
when it comes time to, they can now start generating revenue for us. We've realized that we had enough in the bank in order to support that.
Absolutely. And, I've heard, and this is kind of the consensus is, if you're hiring a first salesperson, it's 6 months to 9 months that before you're going to see anything. And if it's someone that's coming into some structure, as you mentioned, it's going to be, even with the sales machine, it might be 2 to 3 months. I mean, if you're larger, you're 20, 30 million in revenue, you might have a sales manager and a BDR or two. You're probably looking at still a 30 to 60 day ramp up period, even if they're on the phones every day until they're really bringing in some sort of closed new business. And a lot of that's just the nature of the cycle. And I think if you have, as you mentioned, that you have that as a budgeted and you're looking at going to that, you can say, hey, I can set aside. But I think the cash flow is a big thing. We see this all the time. Oh, every January I'm struggling to do this, or no, all my subscriptions and I pay annual contracts are due in June or April. And, making sure you're aware of those cycles as it relates to the actual cash in and out, as opposed to, no, what is my overall profitability in the forecast on a 12-month basis or the budget on a 12-month basis, is really where many business owners, have a misstep because they just aren't, they're not in that day to day of thinking, hey, am I cash or accrual in my thoughts? Am I thinking of this as inflows, outflows? So I think that's where, having that proactive, as you mentioned, on the forecasting side, updating that consistently. So as new information comes in, you are able to better react as a business owner in each period, as opposed to just saying, we'll see where it is. Do we have enough? Oh no, just put it on credit, and having that type of a reactive, decision making structure.
Yeah, I would say in terms of cash flow, one of the strong recommendations I have for clients is just how does your annual price increase process, the timing of that, how does that relate to the timing of when you do compensation increases for your employees? So
Yep.
having those kind of be together in terms of, let's say you're a company that you tend to do that annual price increase at the start of the year. So you do the work in terms of what's that inflation that the business has experienced? What do I forecast my compensation to my employees to be for next year? What's that increase? So you factor in all your inflation, and then you decide, okay, this is around that November timeframe. This is the amount of price increase I want to go out to clients with. You make an announcement, say in early December, with a target of January 1 being that date to implement. And then when it comes time to do your raises for your employees, you do that in around early February timeframe. And the reason why we say to do that, couplefold. One is it allows 2 months for that price increase you go out to your customers to take effect, because there might be some delays in terms of contracts, stuff like that, where you can actually do it. And number two, you want to see how the full year performed, again, against your budget. Because if
Hmm.
the entire company did poorly against that budget, it's really going to be difficult to then do a bunch of raises to the employees because you didn't hit your goals. But if you had a great year and then you have the ability to reward your employees with that, you make that announcement, say early February, with a target of, again, maybe end of February, early March, when we're going to implement that incentive or the compensation increase. Now you factored in cash flow, got your price increase out, then you went with your employee increase, and the two kind of, they go lockstep together.
Yeah. I think that's well said. And, we're kind of getting towards the end here. So just want to wrap up really quickly. For those that didn't watch, a little too long, didn't listen, want that quick 1 minute, how can they ensure that business leaders are really budgeting beyond their spreadsheet?
Well, number one, it can't be simply a spreadsheet exercise with very few people, 1 or 2 people. It just can't be the case. Leadership throughout the organization, they need to play a role to ensure that those goals that you're creating are smart and effective and that you get buy-in from day one. Number two, be able to identify those activities and investments that are needed to achieve your goals. If those two don't align, you're going to have a plan that's not effective as well. And finally, just when you ensure that goal alignment throughout the organization, it's making sure that everyone is prioritizing the right action. So you might have to do that through incentive comp, you might have to do that through roles and responsibilities, but you want everyone marching in the same direction of what's that overall arching goal for the organization. And if you do those things, you're going to have a much more effective plan and be able to achieve it and make sure that it's proactive in nature.
Awesome. Well, Matt, I appreciate it as always. Thank you. Like I said, we will be doing in either later this month or early April. We're going to have one about forecasting, proactive for business owners, all of that. So look on Stride Live on our LinkedIn page. We'll have all of our events posted there. Matt, thank you again for joining today.
Thanks, Casey. I appreciate it.